There is a saying, and it goes like this: those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it. America is self destructing and imploding from within. Oh, yes, America is self destructing and imploding from within. Civil unrest, violence, racial tension on every hand can no longer have a civil conversation in this nation, all because of one particular party that is determined that they want to have it their way. And if it can't be their way, it can't be any way. And it's sad and pathetic that individuals seem to think that they are the only people that are supposed to self exist upon the face of the earth and so called superiority above everyone else. Tyrone Bowman Live. I'm talking about the evils of the Holocaust under Hitler's Nazi regime. The Holocaust is not something that was a hoax. It was real. Individuals' lives were destroyed, businesses were destroyed, heritage was destroyed. Over 6 million plus people died at the hands of one maniacal, bigoted, racist individual. And that uprising seems to continue to exist today. And what was life like for the Jewish people under Hitler's Nazi regime? From bustling Berlin streets in 1933 to the ruins of 1945. This full-length documentary traces how ordinary Jewish life in Germany and across occupied Europe was dismantled step by thorns, stamps, propaganda, ghettos, trains, and camps, until silence was all that remained. Drawing on the film's script, archival records, and survivor testimony, this documentary follows the everyday reality behind headline history. The posters in shop windows, the schoolroom's humiliations, the closed bank accounts, the yellow stars, the brick walls of the ghettos, the sealed cattle cars, the uprisings, and the death marches. This is not only a story of persecution, it is also a record of endurance, Shabbat candles lit in secret, clandestine classrooms, buried diaries, and courage that refused to vanish. The Holocaust should never happen again, period. But America, for some reason, seems to think that one group of people have the right above every other group of people. And this political climate that we're living in, it is a self-destructive political climate. So this video is courtesy, or documentary is courtesy of EpicWar. So let's get it started on Tyrone Bowman Live. There may be some commercials. I'll try to get rid of them as soon as possible.
It was 1933. Berlin's streets still echoed with the clang of trams. Chimney smoke mingled with the smell of fresh bread, and shop windows displayed the latest fabrics, radios. On the surface, the country looked like it was stepping confidently into modernity. But underneath, the gears of the new regime were tightening slowly, like a clock winding itself toward an age of obedience. In the markets, people argued about prices and wages. In classrooms, children sang hymns with still innocent voices. In kitchens, whispers spread about neighbors who had moved away without saying goodbye. What looked like routine was already hiding the first signs of a deep transformation. New forms to fill out, compulsory greetings, flags hanging where once there had been theater posters. Jewish life in Germany and Central Europe didn't appear overnight. It unraveled gradually, woven into daily life, day after day, year after year. It was a slow exclusion that began in paperwork and ended in death. Not only in fiery speeches, but in lines at the local office, notices in the town newspaper, signs banning Jews from a park or a movie theater. The radio didn't just report the news, it set the rhythm. Cinema taught the public when to clap. Schools drilled slogans until they became automatic memory. Propaganda didn't need brute force at first. It worked through repetition, symbols, and silence.
This will be the last video I make for now. I'm being threatened and I don't want to put my family.
In Jewish homes, Shabbat argued about prices and wages. In classrooms, children sang hymns with still innocent voices. In kitchens, whispers spread about neighbors who had moved away without saying goodbye. What looked like routine was already hiding the first signs of a deep transformation. New forms to fill out, compulsory greetings, flags hanging where once there had been theater posters. Jewish life in Germany and Central Europe didn't disappear overnight. It unraveled gradually, woven into daily life, day after day, year after year. It was a slow exclusion that began in paperwork and ended in death. Not only in fiery speeches, but in lines at the local office, notices in the town newspaper, signs banning Jews from a park or a movie theater. The radio didn't just report the news, it set the rhythm. Cinema taught the public when to clap. Schools drilled slogans until they became automatic memory. Propaganda didn't need brute force at first. It worked through repetition, symbols, and silence. And yet, in Jewish homes, Shabbat candles were still lit, chicken soup still simmered, children still laughed in the courtyards. Life went on, despite the rising suspicion, the rumors of layoffs, the neighbors who suddenly looked away. This documentary doesn't speak from the offices of the powerful. It speaks from the streets, the bread lines, the classrooms, the family tables. Year by year, we'll follow how the Nazi regime reshaped the lives of millions of Jews, from the shattering of full citizenship to the descent into ghettos, deportations, and camps. We'll see the signs and the waiting lines. We'll feel the cold and the hunger. We'll hear the radios and the whispers, until the devastation becomes complete. Because tragedy didn't begin at Auschwitz. It began in a classroom where a book was removed, on a park bench where someone got up rather than sit beside a Jew, in an office where a stamp split society in two. The streets knew it, the clocks knew it, the mothers knew it. It was 1933. Power changed hands with parades and torchlight, with speeches of rebirth and unity, but for Jewish families, the feeling was different. As if a door that had been half open for generations was slowly closing. In Berlin cafes, political debate still buzzed. In Frankfurt bookstores, Jewish novels still lined the shelves. In Munich trams, workers and students still sat side by side without much thought. But by April that year, signs began appearing in shop windows. Don't buy from Jews. SA soldiers stood outside family-owned stores, painting yellow marks on the glass of bakeries, pharmacies, clothing shops. The method was simple, or banal. A decree here, a bureaucratic order there. One new form was enough. One stamp that voided a university degree. One list published in a local paper. Gleichschaltung, the so-called coordination, squeezed Jewish doctors, lawyers, and teachers out of their posts. In classrooms, children started hearing their Jewish classmates described as different. The radio blared metallic speeches from the Reichstag. The cinema projected images of massive crowds beneath red flags with black swastikas. Teachers demanded the compulsory salute, even from the youngest children, who raised their arms shyly, not yet understanding the weight of the gesture. And still, Jewish families tried to keep life normal. In Leipzig, a mother corrected her son's math homework. In Hamburg, a grandfather still took his granddaughter to the zoo on Sundays. but the signs were there. A neighbor who no longer said hello, a mailman delivering dismissal letters, a bank closing an account without explanation. Obedience was learned in silence. Violence wasn't always needed, just the threat of losing a job, being shamed in the town square, or watching one's children humiliated in school. By 1935, exclusion became law. At the Nuremberg Party Congress, statutes were passed stripping Jews of German citizenship. Overnight, they ceased being neighbors with rights. They became subjects. Marriages between Jews and non-Jews were banned. And with that, rumors hardened into certainty. The wall rising between Jews and society was no longer just social. It was legal. At the markets, the impact was clear. Lifelong customers who no longer entered the shops, doctors without patients, teachers without classrooms. In the kitchens, voices dropped lower, and children were warned not to speak too much in public. Something had shifted. Nobody said it aloud, but everybody felt it. Exclusion was no longer an attitude. It was a system. It was 1936. The country presented itself to the world like a polished showcase. Freshly ironed flags, stadiums filled to the brim, uniformed crowds applauding in perfect rhythm. The Berlin Olympic Games became the regime's grand display window. Everything was polished, calculated, arranged to hide the shadow already falling over the Jews. On the main streets, anti-Semitic posters were temporarily removed. Shop windows that had been smeared with paint were scrubbed and redecorated. Even some newspapers were told to soften their language. To foreign visitors, Germany looked modern, disciplined, welcoming. But in Jewish neighborhoods, behind the stage set, reality hadn't changed. In small bakeries, longtime customers had stopped coming. In schools, Jewish children were pushed to the back rows, their notebooks scrutinized with suspicion. At the universities, Jewish professors had all but vanished, empty chairs now filled with party loyalists.
I caught my stepson spying on me in the shower.
That's one of those garbage AI commercials.
Patient. A bank quietly closed a Jewish family's account. A company discreetly fired its Jewish bookkeeper. The postman arrived with new forms, revoked work permits, inflated tax bills. One sheet of paper, one stamp, one signature. That was enough. The radio, omnipresent in living rooms thanks to the Volksempire, the cheap set distributed en masse, hammered out messages of unity, purity, greatness. Cinema reels portrayed the Führer as a protective father. In classrooms, teachers displayed racial charts and maps, categorizing students by type. And still, daily life tried to endure. In Jewish kitchens, soups still simmered. Poems were still read in German and Yiddish. Birthdays were still celebrated with makeshift candles. But the air had changed. Neighbors looked away. Conversations fell silent when someone entered the room. Letters to relatives abroad were written cautiously, knowing they might be opened. 1936 ended with the deceptive feeling that maybe, just maybe, the worst had passed. The Olympics had dulled the visibility of persecution. Some dared to hope that life might stabilize. But it was a false calm, the silence before the storm. 1937 arrived without any dramatic rupture, but with pressure that grew more and more suffocating. It was the year when Jewish businesses began to be Aryanized, transferred to non-Jewish owners, often at ridiculous prices. Shops that had been in families for generations changed hands overnight. The sign on the door was the same, but the owner was not. In the markets, the difference was obvious. Stores that once felt like trusted gathering places now seemed cold, staffed by strangers. Some customers came back, others never did. The former owners were left with empty cash boxes and broken lives. The process was administrative, legal, impeccably bureaucratic. Documents signed in offices, notices delivered by messengers, records filed neatly in cardboard folders. It wasn't a noisy looting. It was a silent dispossession. Propaganda echoed alongside this process, repeating the same lines until exhaustion. The Jew is a foreigner in our land. The Jew lives off the work of others. In classrooms, children copied these phrases onto blackboards. On the radio, official voices repeated them with metallic conviction. But in the courtyards, other voices could be heard. Mothers comforting their children after insults at school, grandfathers telling stories of freer times, families beginning to hide valuables in basements or behind walls. And still, hope didn't vanish completely. Some still thought they could wait it out, that things would change. 1937 closed with that double feeling, life that still tried to be normal, but already marked by suspicion. And then came 1938, the breaking point, the year the varnish cracked and persecution showed itself without disguise. In March, Austria was annexed into the Reich in the Anschluss. Vienna's streets filled with flags and parades. For Austrian Jews, the transformation was immediate. Public humiliations, forced to scrub the streets on their knees, fired from their jobs, branded as enemy. What had been gradual in Germany arrived in Austria as something brutal and sudden. That same year, in September, the Reich issued new decrees requiring Jewish passports to be stamped with a large red J. They were no longer just degraded citizens. They were now marked, labeled, turned into permanent suspects. But the darkest night came in November, Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. On November 9th and 10th, 1938, shop windows were smashed, synagogues set ablaze, Jewish businesses looted. Entire city streets were carpeted with shattered glass. The smoke of burning synagogues blackened the sky. Dozens of Jews were murdered, thousands arrested and sent to concentration camps. In kitchens, meals sat half-served because someone pounded violently at the door. In bedrooms, children hid under beds while glass shattered downstairs. In synagogues, Torah scrolls were hurled into the street and trampled. Propaganda called it a spontaneous outburst of the people. But everyone knew it had been orchestrated, planned, encouraged from above. Police looked the other way. Fire brigades only acted to keep flames from spreading to Aryan buildings. And yet, even in that night of fire and glass, there were gestures of humanity. Neighbors who offered to hide a child, employees who gave warnings in advance, strangers who handed over keys to escape through a back door. But these were exceptions, small lights in a spreading darkness. After Kristallnacht, no one could deceive themselves anymore. Jewish life in Germany was shattered, businesses destroyed, synagogues in ashes, men imprisoned. Emigration, once an option, became an urgent necessity. Those with means tried to flee. Those without were trapped.
Watch what butter does to your coffee.
Grew heavier. On trams, people avoided the eyes of Kristallnacht survivors. In markets, voices no longer rose above a whisper. Fear was no longer only Jewish. It had spread to everyone who had seen and remained silent. 1938 ended with a devastating certainty. Exclusion had turned into open persecution, and the question was no longer if one could resist, but if one could survive. The smoke of the synagogues still hung in the air, and the whole world had smelled it. It was 1939. The air was thick with foreboding. On classroom maps, the borders already looked too narrow for the grandiose visions blaring on the radio. The clocks ticked through a tense waiting game, a rumor of war that pulsed through markets, breadlines, and anxious parents. On September 1st, the sirens confirmed what everyone feared. Germany had invaded Poland. War was no longer a threat. It was here. And for Poland's Jews, one of the largest and most vibrant communities in Europe, it marked the beginning of an unprecedented descent into confinement and degradation. In Warsaw, German soldiers filled the streets. In Łódź, new decrees plastered every corner. In Krakow, church bells rang over the tramp of heavy boots. For Jewish families, the change was immediate. Radios confiscated, homes seized, midnight raids. A single order nailed to a wall was enough to transform the life of an entire neighborhood. The machinery was simple, and that was what made it terrifyingly effective. Censuses came first. Every Jew had to register, provide details, list their relatives. Then, the compulsory armbands, white bands with a blue Star of David. No denunciations were needed anymore. The stigma was visible, unavoidable, woven into daily life. In the markets, Jews could shop only at restricted hours. In public squares, benches carried signs, Jews forbidden. In schools, Jewish children were expelled. Rabbis saw entire libraries confiscated. Synagogues were closed, converted into warehouses or stables. Propaganda accompanied every step. Posters, newspapers, loudspeakers in public squares. It was all the same message. Jews were guilty of the war, parasites to be separated. Caricatures twisted their faces into grotesque masks. Speeches spoke of cleanliness and order. And still, in Jewish homes, candles were lit on Friday nights. In kitchens, mothers improvised soups from scraps, sharing the little they had. In courtyards, children still played, though they were already learning to go silent when soldiers' boots echoed nearby. Life tried to retreat into the private and the intimate, even as suspicion and fear seeped in through every crack. In October 1939, the machinery took a decisive turn. Ghettos began. In Poland, entire communities were forced into confined districts. At first, makeshift fences of wire. Later, solid walls of brick. Warsaw, Łódź, Lublin, Białystok. Names that became synonymous with captivity. In Warsaw, the ghetto was sealed in November 1940. A city within a city, surrounded by walls more than 3 meters high, topped with barbed wire. On one side, life went on as usual. Inside, more than 400,000 Jews crammed into a tiny space. Day-to-day life in the ghetto meant hunger. Official rations were meager, barely 184 calories per person, a slow death sentence. No meat, no milk, not enough bread. Smuggling became the only path to survival. Nimble children slipping through cracks in the wall to bring back potatoes, onions, scraps of bread. Many never returned. In the ghetto streets, poverty multiplied. Entire families squeezed into a single room. Winter cold seeped in through broken windows. Hungry bodies lay in doorways, and amid the misery, cultural life still struggled to endure. Clandestine schools, concerts, plays, because dignity itself was a form of resistance. In Łódź, the ghetto took an even harsher shape. There, the elderly community leader, Mordecai Chaim Rumkowski, agreed to head the Judenrat, the Jewish council imposed by the Germans. He believed the only chance of survival was to prove useful, to turn the ghetto into one giant workshop, producing for the Reich. People sewed uniforms, made shoes, repaired equipment. But the wages were meaningless. Hunger in exchange for an uncertain hope. The systems of control were relentless. The Judenrat handed out permits, organized censuses, submitted worker.
You're saying if I buy this and plug it into my TV, I can watch channels?
A slow death sentence. No meat, no milk, not enough bread. Smuggling became the only path to survival. Nimble children slipping through cracks in the wall to bring back potatoes, onions, scraps of bread. Many never returned. In the ghetto streets, poverty multiplied. Entire families squeezed into a single room. Winter cold seeped in through broken windows. Hungry bodies lay in doorways, and amid the misery, Cultural life still struggled to endure. Clandestine schools, concerts, plays, because dignity itself was a form of resistance. In Łódź, the ghetto took an even harsher shape. There, the elderly community leader, Mordecai Chaim Rumkowski, agreed to head the Judenrat, the Jewish council imposed by the Germans. He believed the only chance of survival was to prove useful, to turn the ghetto into one giant workshop, producing for the Reich. People sewed uniforms, made shoes, repaired equipment. But the wages were meaningless. Hunger in exchange for an uncertain hope. The systems of control were relentless. The Judenrat handed out permits, organized censuses, submitted worker lists. The Jewish police, under German orders, enforced the rules. And behind it all, the Germans managed scarcity itself, deciding who would live one more day. Inside the ghetto markets, official currency no longer mattered. Bread crusts were traded for buttons, old shoes for potatoes. Children learned to recognize the sound of a patrol before they learned to read. Mothers boiled watery soup with potato peels. Fathers tried to keep conversations alive that weren't only about hunger. Reich radio didn't reach inside the ghetto, but news still spread. Like whispers. That the war might end soon, that Britain was holding out, that the Soviets would not surrender. They were rumors, but they offered a breath of relief. And yet, fear was constant. Each raid could mean the disappearance of a neighbor, a cousin, a friend. It was enough to lack the right papers, to be suspected of smuggling, to simply be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Outside Poland, in Germany itself, Jewish life had become unbearable after Kristallnacht. Many tried to flee. Some managed to emigrate to Palestine, to the United States, to South America. Others were trapped by bureaucracy, immigration quotas, missing visas. For them, the war sealed the exits completely. By 1940, with France occupied and half of Europe under Nazi control, the feeling was clear there was nowhere left to run. The Jews still in Germany had become almost invisible, hidden in back rooms, relying on the bravery or indifference of neighbors. In Poland, ghettos were already the norm. German propaganda displayed maps filled with victorious arrows, speeches of unity, images of smiling soldiers. But inside the ghetto walls, reality was different. Hunger, cold, fear. The distance between triumphant films and the misery of Warsaw streets was immense. And yet, life pushed back. Secret diaries were written, children's classes organized, violins played with worn-out strings. An entire generation learned that simply surviving was an act of rebellion. 1940 ended with a suspicion that few dared to say out loud, the ghetto wasn't the end. It was only a step. The walls weren't built to protect, but to contain until something worse arrived. Winter was bitter, hunger insatiable, silence heavy, and beyond the walls, the trains kept running. It was 1941. Calendars no longer marked seasons, but campaigns. German clocks ticked to the rhythm of a war spreading like a stain without end.
Watch what magnesium does to your bowels.
If you have
Advance, Jewish space shrank further, reduced to a corner of fear. In June came Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Millions of soldiers crossed the border at dawn, with endless columns of trucks and tanks. But behind them, almost unseen at first, came others, the Einsatzgruppen, the death squads. Their mission was cold and clear: follow the army's advance and wipe out the Jews in the newly occupied territories. The first weeks were a tear in the fabric of life. In towns across Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states, Jews were pulled from their homes by name, taken to the outskirts, forced to dig pits. The gunfire rang out in fields, forests, open ground. At Babi Yar, on the edge of Kyiv, more than 33,000 Jews were murdered in just 2 days in September. There were no trials, no courts, only a census, a denunciation, a visible armband. The machinery of extermination was direct, brutal, immediate. The stutter of machine guns, the screams, the silence that followed, the smell of gunpowder and freshly turned earth clinging to entire towns. In villages, neighbors watched from behind shuttered windows. Some helped hide, others pointed the way. Obedience and fear weighed more heavily than compassion. And the result was always the same. Streets emptied of Jewish shops, Jewish voices gone. In the ghettos of Poland, life became even more precarious. The war in the East brought more hunger, more seizures, more raids. The Germans tightened the isolation. Higher walls, sealed gates, constant surveillance. Inside, rations dropped even lower. 184 calories a day in Warsaw, barely enough to last a few weeks. Smuggling became vital, but also deadly. Every child caught with bread in a pocket risked being shot in the street. The controls multiplied. Lists for forced labor, quotas of deportees handed over at random, permits that meant the difference between going to a factory or a grave. Bureaucracy was merciless. A single stamp decided life or death. Propaganda didn't stop. In newspapers, on the radio, in speeches, the refrain was the same. Jews were to blame for the war, for hunger, for British bombs. The German public listened, nodded, stayed silent. In occupied lands, the message was translated and spread, an endless chant. And yet, inside the ghettos, life still sought ways to persist. In Warsaw, Emanuel Ringelblum organized the secret archive Oyneg Shabs, an effort to document Jewish life under the yoke, so the world would one day know. Diaries, posters, lists, stories, even children's drawings were collected, all buried in metal boxes and milk cans, like seeds of memory for an uncertain future. In 1941, another order came. All Jews in Germany had to wear the yellow star sewn onto their chest. It was no longer a religious symbol, but a badge of segregation. To walk with it in Berlin, Hamburg, Vienna meant being singled out, insulted, attacked. It meant never escaping the gaze. On the streets, some looked away, others spat. For many German Jews, that star ended any lingering illusion of belonging. They were no longer degraded citizens. They were pariahs, visible, vulnerable. Meanwhile, the war gave no respite. The early victories in the Soviet Union seemed to confirm Germany's invincibility, and with them came radicalization. Inside the regime, the language hardened, no longer of expulsion or segregation, but of total elimination. In Berlin offices, in party headquarters, a new term began to circulate: Endlösung, the final solution. At street level, that shift had no name yet, but it could be felt in the bodies falling into pits, in deportations that grew more frequent, in the atmosphere of doom that filled ghetto kitchens. Mothers improvised recipes with rotten potatoes. Children learned to read in clandestine schools, copying letters on scraps of paper. Rabbis whispered prayers. And everyone, absolutely everyone, knew that time was running out. The trains began to take center stage. Freight cars, once used for coal or cattle, were now crammed with people. The destinations weren't always clear. Some led to forced labor camps, others to places unknown. Eastern stations became waypoints to disappearance. For those left behind, absence was crushing. An empty bed, a notebook left in a drawer, a cup with no owner. The ghetto learned to live with the unthinkable, that each night someone vanished forever. Official propaganda spoke of resettlements, of new work in the East. Posters showed images of order and discipline. But in Jewish kitchens, the language was different. People spoke of transports, of lists, of pits. Fear already had its own vocabulary. And yet in the midst of darkness, resistance appeared in small acts. Diaries scribbled on ragged paper, secret libraries, songs children memorized to preserve their language, their culture. Because even in degradation, there was a will to affirm life. 1941 ended with a brutal certainty. Hell had expanded. It was no longer just walls, no longer just humiliations. It was mass shootings, packed trains, compulsory yellow stars. The question was no longer whether one could survive one more day. The question was how to do so without losing all sense of humanity. The filled pits, the higher walls, the stitched stars. Extermination had begun, though it still wasn't called by that name. It was 1942. Smoke became part of the landscape. On war maps, arrows pointed to distant fronts, but in the kitchens of the ghetto, in the sealed train cars, in the freshly built camps, the reality was something else. Extermination had become a program, a policy, a routine. In January, in an elegant villa on the shores of Lake Wannsee, just outside Berlin, a group of bureaucrats, party officials, and ministry representatives gathered. The Wannsee conference lasted only a few hours. There were no fiery speeches, no grand proclamations, only tables, numbers, calculations. 11 million European Jews were discussed as if they were inventory. They spoke of trains, destinations, efficiency. The final solution to the Jewish question was no longer an insinuation. It became a systematic plan. What in 1941 had been mass shootings and sealed ghettos, in 1942 was transformed into a network of extermination camps. Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, anonymous points on a map that soon became synonymous with death.
I can't get hard, not even with the blue pills.
Until then, a labor camp was expanded with gas chambers and crematoria. The mechanisms were cold, bureaucratic, industrial. The Reichsbahn, the German railways, scheduled the trains. The Gestapo and the SS compiled lists of entire communities. Jewish councils, the Judenrat, were ordered to prepare transports, and the wagons filled day after day. In Warsaw, entire families were herded to the Umschlagplatz, the loading yard by the tracks. Mothers with children in their arms, elderly leaning on canes, young people clutching small suitcases. They were told they were going to work in the East, to bring only essentials. In truth, they were going to camps where their luggage would be confiscated, their belongings sorted, their bodies destroyed. Inside the cattle cars, the air thinned. No water, no space, no light. Journeys lasted days, filled with screams, sobs, silence. Floors covered in filth and in bodies that hadn't survived. And upon arrival, the cries turned to orders. Quickly out, leave the bags, form lines. At Treblinka, arrival was the end. There were no permanent barracks, only platforms, sheds, chambers disguised as showers. The trains rolled in, the doors opened. Passengers were shoved out, separated, stripped, murdered. Within hours, an entire transport vanished. All that remained were piles of shoes, eyeglasses, shorn hair. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, the process reached an even larger scale. Prisoners selected for labor were tattooed with numbers on their arms. The rest were led into gas chambers, where Zyklon B crystals rained down from the ceiling. The silence afterward was absolute, broken only by the roar of the crematoria engines. In the ghettos, life was reduced to waiting. Any day could mean deportation. Warsaw's streets filled with orphans, with the exhausted begging for scraps. In Łódź, Romkowski announced his infamous decree, "Give me your children." Under German orders, he demanded children be handed over for deportation. Mothers screamed. Fathers resisted. The Jewish police dragged little ones to the trucks. It was the ultimate perversion. Parents forced to choose among their children, community leaders turned into tools of the machinery of death. The mechanisms were subtle and brutal at once. Voluntary resettlements were announced. Promises of better conditions were offered. Believing was enough to walk toward the Umschlagplatz, and those who hesitated were dragged anyway. Propaganda kept working. The German public saw images of military victories, heard speeches about final solutions, but rarely knew the details. Newspapers spoke of relocations and labor colonies. Language was a mask. The reality happened behind walls, behind barbed wire, in camps without names. And still, some news leaked. Soldiers sent letters. Railway workers spoke at home. Rumors spread in parish halls. But overall, silence prevailed. Inside the camps, life was only a shadow. In Auschwitz, those chosen for labor slept in overcrowded barracks on damp planks. Hunger was constant, rations meager, stale bread, watery soup. Disease ran rampant through weakened bodies. Medical experiments added to the horror. Injections, operations, mutilations. And yet even there, moments of human resistance flickered. A violinist played at night. A prisoner scribbled poems on stolen scraps of paper. A mother shared her bread with her child, knowing it wasn't enough for either. Humanity tried to surface among the ruins. In Warsaw, some understood the ghetto was only a waiting room for death. In secret, groups of young people began to gather weapons to plan an uprising. The revolt hadn't yet begun, but the seed was planted. Better to die fighting than to march on to a transport. Meanwhile, the underground archives continued to collect evidence. Ringelblum's Oyneg Schabers buried testimonies, lists of deportees, children's drawings, documents hidden in the ground, written with the certainty that bodies would be destroyed, but words might survive. 1942 ended with numbers beyond comprehension. Millions of Jews had already been murdered, in ghettos, in pits, in extermination camps, and still the program carried on. Auschwitz's chimneys burned without pause. The trains ran day and night. The smoke was real. So was the silence. In the Jewish kitchens that still remained, people spoke in whispers, prayed in secret, slept with suitcases ready. Life had become waiting, and waiting had become a sentence. The year closed with a devastating image. Chimneys glowing against the winter sky, and the certainty that extermination was no longer rumor, nor exception, nor a temporary measure. It was central policy, the very heart of the regime. Obedience no longer needed justification. It was enough to look at the smoke. It was 1943. The smoke still rose, but it was no longer just smoke. It was signal. It was proof. It was a scream.
This is the most powerful lockpicking tool on the market. Slide it.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, you're watching Tyrone Bowman Live. And I'm showing you a documentary today about the Holocaust and the evils of the Hitler Nazi regime. And I'll be bringing you other documentaries as well. I'll be talking about the Palestinians. I'm going to talk about slavery. I'll be bringing documentaries about any type of injustice perpetrated upon any people anywhere. It's time to wake up. If something happening here in America, it's not nice, it's not pretty, and it's not good. Always remember this quotation, quote, "Those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it." All that needs to happen for tyranny to continue is for the so-called good people to sit by and do nothing. And when it begins to affect you, your town, your city, your family, then it becomes a problem. The suffrage of any people is the suffrage of all people. Almighty God didn't create this world for one group of people to think that they're superior to all other peoples upon the face of the earth and everybody must bow down to them. That's the reason why America is imploding from within. Let me get back to this documentary.
In the newsreels, speeches spoke of but words might survive. 1942 ended with numbers beyond comprehension. Millions of Jews had already been murdered, in ghettos, in pits, in extermination camps. And still, the program carried on. Auschwitz's chimneys burned without pause. The trains ran day and night. The smoke was real. So was the silence. In the Jewish kitchens that still remained, people spoke in whispers, prayed in secret, slept with suitcases ready. Life had become waiting, and waiting had become a sentence. The year closed with a devastating image. Chimneys glowing against the winter sky, and the certainty that extermination was no longer rumor, nor exception, nor a temporary measure. It was central policy, the very heart of the regime. Obedience no longer needed justification. It was enough to look at the smoke. It was 1943. The smoke still rose, but it was no longer just...
Let me address this comment real quick. What about the Yugoslavs, Libyans, and Ethiopians who were genocided collectively in millions by the fascist regime of Mussolini? One video at a time. See, that's the problem with a lot of people in the comment section. You can only do one thing at a time. And today, I'm dealing with the Holocaust. I will get around to Stalin, to Mussolini. I'll get around to all these little dictators. Eventually, I'm going to bring the documentaries pertaining to everything. But today, I'm talking about the Holocaust. And I will be talking about the transatlantic slave voyage as well. This channel is a learning channel. This channel is not like other channels. I don't come over here to be the buffoon, to sing and to dance and to tap dance. I'm here to inform and to educate and to let men and women know we as a people better learn to work together or we're all going to be destroyed. All right, now let me get back to what I'm doing here.
Smoke. It was signal. It was proof. It was a scream. On official maps, Germany still looked victorious. In the newsreels, speeches spoke of heroic resistance against Britain and of advances in the east. But in the ghettos, in the camps, in the forests, another language was taking shape. The language of despair turning into resistance. In Warsaw, the ghetto had shrunk to a shadow. Of the more than 400,000 locked inside in 1940, only tens of thousands remained. Most had been deported to Treblinka. The streets lay empty, filled with rubble and corpses. And yet, among the ruins, young people of the GOB, the Jewish Combat Organization, armed themselves with old pistols, Molotov cocktails, rusty rifles. Their slogan was clear: "We will not go like sheep to the slaughter." On April 19th, 1943, on the eve of Passover, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising began. When German troops tried to enter, they were met with gunfire from windows, with homemade grenades, with flames from underground tunnels. For nearly a month, a handful of fighters held off the most powerful army in Europe. In burned-out kitchens, pots of dirty water still boiled. In basements, children learned to move silently so as not to reveal hiding places. On rooftops, young men and women hurled themselves into combat, certain they would die. Smoke from burning houses filled the sky. The entire city saw the flames. On May 16th, General Jürgen Stroop declared the ghetto destroyed. Warsaw's great synagogue was blown up, a symbol of victory. But the image that endured was not of German triumph, but of the dignity of those who had resisted the impossible. Resistance was not limited to Warsaw. In ghettos of Białystok, Vilnius, Częstochowa, clandestine groups rose up against deportations. In Treblinka, Sobibor, Auschwitz, prisoners staged uprisings, set fire to crematoria, cut through fences. Most were killed, but some escaped to tell the story. In the forests of Belarus and Ukraine, thousands of Jewish fugitives formed partisan bands. They lived in caves, survived on what they found, sabotaged railways, ambushed German patrols. It was armed resistance, but also resistance through survival itself. Meanwhile, the machinery of death sped up.
This yellow crust is why your nail fungus won't go away.
Of Action Reinhard. the final liquid. It was armed resistance, but also resistance through survival itself. Meanwhile, the machinery of death sped up. 1943 was the year of Action Reinhard, the final liquidation of Poland's ghettos and the mass deportation of their inhabitants to extermination camps. Lublin, Krakow, Radom. One after another, the walls came down, not to liberate, to empty. The pattern was always the same. Orders pasted on walls, transport lists, trains pulling into crowded stations. Entire families vanished in days. Ghettos were left in silence, with doors ajar, utensils abandoned, toys broken in empty courtyards. In the camps, the process grew more impersonal, more industrial. At Auschwitz, gas chambers ran at full capacity. Crematoria worked day and night. Bodies became smoke. Smoke became ash. Ash became dust, scattered into the wind. And yet even in that darkness, life looked for cracks. In frozen barracks, mothers still whispered lullabies. In forced workshops, workers carved small figurines from scraps of wood, hiding them under floorboards. In the basements of dying ghettos, clandestine weddings were held, prayers were recited, diaries were written. Ringelblum's Oyneg Sherbes archive continued until the end. When its last members were discovered and killed, the boxes of papers remained buried. Decades later, they would be unearthed, mute witnesses to a world destroyed. In 1944, the war began to turn. After Stalingrad and Kursk, the German army was in retreat in the east. The Allies landed in Italy. The bombing of Germany intensified. But instead of slowing down the machinery of extermination, the regime sped it up. In March 1944, Hungary was occupied by German troops. In just a few weeks, more than 400,000 Hungarian Jews were deported to Auschwitz. Extermination at maximum speed, overcrowded trains, ramps overwhelmed, crematoria bursting. The images were infernal. Endless lines spilling out of wagons, officers deciding with the flick of a hand, children torn from their mothers, smoke a constant on the horizon. In Warsaw, the entire city rose up in August 1944 against the German occupation. The uprising lasted 63 days. The few Jews who had survived in hiding among the ruins joined the insurgents. The city was leveled, its districts demolished, its population massacred. Warsaw became rubble, a landscape of ashes reflecting the devastation of all Europe. German propaganda still shouted of victory, of purity, of loyalty to the Führer. But the reality was different. Trains still rolled toward Auschwitz, even as the Reich wavered. Extermination wasn't a side project, it was the priority. In makeshift kitchens, stale bread was still divided among many. In frozen barracks, prayers were still whispered. In damp forests, rusted guns still fired at German patrols. Life resisted however it could, amid ruins. 1944 ended with a devastated landscape. Ghettos wiped out, camps running at full capacity, cities in ruins, and yet also with a horizon slowly opening. The Soviet advance liberated the first territories, the first mass graves were uncovered, the first reports reached the world. But for those still inside, at Auschwitz, Ravensbrück, Majdanek, Bergen-Belsen, the future was still smoke. The rumor of German defeat spread, but extermination did not stop. The Reich could stagger. The chimneys still burned. It was 1945. The Reich collapsed like a burning building, but in the kitchens of liquidated ghettos, in the barracks of the camps, in the wagons still rolling to nowhere, the war felt endless. Defeat showed itself in the bones of German soldiers, in the bombed-out cities, in clocks that no longer kept time. And yet, the machinery of extermination didn't stop. It grew more desperate, more cruel, more chaotic. In January, the Red Army advanced into Poland. The Germans began evacuating Auschwitz. It wasn't immediate liberation, but forced march. Tens of thousands of prisoners were driven out into the winter cold, without food, without shelter, deeper into the Reich. These became the death marches. Those who fell were shot by the roadside. The ice kept thousands of bodies. Inside Auschwitz, when the Soviets entered on January 27th, they found only a few thousand emaciated survivors, too weak to walk. They found warehouses full of objects. Piles of shoes, suitcases with names painted on them, tons of shorn hair. Material evidence of extermination, organized like inventory. In Germany, collapse was felt on every corner. Cities lay in ruins, Berlin bombed, Dresden in flames, Hamburg a sea of rubble. And among those ruins, prisoners evacuated from camps were dragged from one place to another. Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald. Each transfer was deadlier than the last. In Bergen-Belsen, barracks became living graves. No food, no water, no medicine. Corpses filled the halls. Typhus spread like a shadow. When the British entered in April, they found tens of thousands of piled bodies and only a handful of barely conscious survivors. A young girl died there days later, Anne Frank, whose diary would give voice to a silenced generation. At Dachau, Buchenwald, Ravensbrück, the scenes were the same. Walking skeletons, hollow-eyed children, nameless corpses.
Hey, listen, did you know there's a huge demand for
Soldiers photographed what they saw, so no one could accuse them of invention. The machinery of extermination had turned erratic. No more scheduled trains, no more orderly lists, only improvisation, spite, frantic destruction of evidence. Archives burned, crematoria blown up, pits dug open to erase traces. But objects remained, mountains of eyeglasses, toothbrushes, kitchen utensils. Each one witness. Propaganda fell silent. Radios no longer proclaimed victories, only desperate calls for final resistance. Newspapers repeated hollow slogans. The German population saw columns of prisoners marching through villages, saw bodies by the roadside. Many looked away, others understood too late. For the Jews who survived, 1945 was not triumph, it was emptiness. Leaving a camp did not mean returning home. Many homes were occupied, destroyed, confiscated. Jewish neighborhoods lay vacant, synagogues reduced to ruins. Those who tried to return to Poland met hostility, even pogroms, like in Kielce in 1946. Their homeland had become hostile ground. In makeshift kitchens of displaced persons' camps, survivors shared bread with strangers, searched lists for names, waited for news of family. Most never found theirs again. The Allies recorded, photographed, filmed. The world saw images of stacked corpses, of starving prisoners, of broken ovens. But no camera could capture the silence afterward, the echo of absent voices, the absence of entire communities. In Berlin streets, defeat was measured in loose bricks, in dead stoves, in torn flags. In Warsaw, only ruins remained. The city destroyed, its Jewish population annihilated. In Budapest, synagogues stood empty. In Salonika, the Jewish quarters were gone. In Vilnius, the Jerusalem of the north had become a void. And yet, some survivors began to write in improvised notebooks, on stolen scraps of paper, in hidden diaries. Their words became seeds of memory. Some children emigrated to Palestine, others to America, others stayed in Europe, carrying an impossible silence. The clocks had marked the end of the war, but for them, the war never truly ended. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. In the streets of London, Paris, New York, there was celebration. In Berlin, there were ruins. In the liberated camps, there was silence. The surviving Jews did not celebrate. They wept. The war had ended, but not the loss. Among 6 million dead, each had a name, a family, a seat at a table that would never be filled again. Life under the Nazi regime ended in ashes, in silence, in emptiness. And the most devastating part was not only the scale of death, but the everyday steps that led to it. Forms, stamps, waiting lines, averted gazes, radios playing, doors closing. In 1945, among the ruins of Europe, what remained were orphaned shoes, stopped watches, unsent letters, objects more eloquent than any speech. Obedience no longer needed orders. It was enough to look around. Silence was the last witness. The journey began in 1933, with posters in shop windows, with a compulsory salute, with a bank closing its doors to a neighbor. And it ended in 1945, with ruined cities, chimneys extinguished but still smoking, watches stopped on ownerless wrists. Between those 2 points stretched the real lives of Jews under the Nazi regime. Lives stripped first of rights, then of space, then of voice, and finally of distance. What hurts most when looking back is not only the ending, but the progression. It wasn't immediate. It was daily. Just a form, a stamp, a glance of rejection, a customer who stopped entering a store, a child forced to sit in the back row at school, a neighbor who shut the door when footsteps echoed on the stairs. Extermination was woven with threads of indifference, of silence, of routines that seemed harmless. Radios repeated slogans until they became official truth. Theaters taught crowds to clap in unison. Schools raised generations to identify the other through drawings and maps. Propaganda didn't shout, it whispered persistently until discrimination seemed natural. And yet in Jewish kitchens, in back courtyards, in hidden synagogues, a candle was still lit, soup still cooked, stories still told to children. To resist was also to live, to affirm dignity in the face of hunger and persecution. That quiet obstinacy is an inseparable part of the story. When the ghettos came, when deportations began, when sealed wagons filled with suffocating bodies, the world looked on in disbelief. Or turned.
Watch how butter affects love handles.
I'm going to say this before this video ends. During the trial of Nuremberg, those German officials and officers that were captured, they tried to justify the annihilation and extermination of Jewish men and women by simply state they were following orders. That was their callous answer. They were following orders. That seems to be the norm of today. They're only following orders. Look around and see what's happening in America. This is supposed to be the land of the free and the home of the brave. We're not blind. People can pretend like they can't see, that they can't hear, and that they don't know what's happening. I'm going to say it again, until it comes to your city, your neighborhood, your town, your family, and your friends. Most people are just going to pretend that they don't see what's happening. The Republican Party is out of control. And you know why? Because they let it happen. That's why.
Settlements, transfers, work in the East. Language was the first disguise of the crime. The ending is known, 6 million Jews murdered. But the ending must not obscure the process, because tragedy did not begin at Auschwitz. It began much earlier, in every gesture of exclusion, in every complicit silence, in every door that closed. At war's end, what remained were objects, piles of shoes, eyeglasses, toothbrushes, suitcases with names. Everyday items that spoke louder than any testimony. Proof that behind every number was a life, a trade, a home, a seat at a table once occupied. The silence afterward was the last witness. A silence made of sentences, of voices that would never sing again, of prayers never repeated, of streets that had lost their neighbors. To look at real life under the Nazi regime is to see what can happen when the everyday becomes complicity, when clocks measure obedience, when walls rise without protest, when smoke becomes part of the landscape. The radios fell silent. The chimneys went dark. But the echo remains. And it reminds us that obedience no longer needs orders. If this story inspired you, challenged you, or helped you see World War II in a new light, we'd be honored if you joined our growing community.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, let me take a quick break. I'll be right back. All right, everybody, thank you for your patience. You've been watching Tyrone Bowman Live, a documentary about the Holocaust. Here is a book about General George Patton. You need to read this book. It gives you good insight as to what he was thinking strategically, militarily, and how he forged ahead. So, it's by Bill O'Reilly and Martin Dugard. It's called Killing Patton. Check this book out. It's a must read. Reading is powerful. Don't allow the internet and the stupidity of AI do thinking for you. Do your own reading, writing, researching for yourselves. Take the time to learn, to grow, and to know. And stop being suspicious of everyone, everything, and everybody. Because subliminal messages are often run through the internet. And don't think that the internet is not being used by the far right for purposes of criminality. In Arkansas, they have what they call a whites-only town. That's right, in Arkansas, a whites-only town under the watchful eye of its governor, who was once the press secretary during the first Trump administration, Sarah Huckabee. And if that had been any other group of people, especially black people, with a blacks-only town, you know that would have been shut down before it happened. The billionaires of who control this world and the trillionaires, they don't want peace. They want war. Never surrender. Never quit.